We're back for the final TVM Town Hall of the semester. Today's topic is one that's become a point of contention in this country, guns in America. I'm your host, Christy O'Neill. Today's panelists have their fair share of experience with our country's gun laws. We have Jeffrey Dempsey, Gemma Rosado, and Eric Smith joining us. Thank you guys so much for being here. So first, I just want to start off by, if you guys could kind of go down the line and just give your experience with the topic today.
Sure. So I serve as the program director for Ceasefire PA. We're the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania's largest gun violence prevention advocacy group. We do a lot of educational work about this issue, and then we sort of work with people to get them to take the next step, which is going to their elected officials, talking about policies that they'd like to see in place to try to curb these trends of gun violence.
Gemma?
Hi, I'm just a concerned citizen, and I was one of 5 on top of about 20 other people behind me that organized the local March for Our Lives march. We had 5 core coordinators doing that, all adults, and then enlisted some students, and we had about 1,200 people at our march in Scranton, so we had a really good turnout, so I'm just here to represent that.
And Eric?
I'm a student here, but before I was a student, I spent around 4 to 5 years active duty in the U.S. Army. I was a reconnaissance scout, and then I was also in armor, so I've kind of dealt with all sorts of firearms, weapons, different experiences, and currently I'm in the National Guard as a sergeant, as a combat medic, and I'm in the pre-PA program, so I kind of have a little bit of experience on both wielding the weapon and seeing kind of what it does to people and how it kind of affects that. So
Great. And so to kind of get a little bit of both perspectives, I know this is a very, very nuanced, complex issue, but can one of you or a couple of you kind of just explain the argument for gun control, the argument against it, the general kind of basics of that?
I think it's important to note, it seems easy to compare this issue to other countries, right? However, one key difference within the United States is that in other countries you have the ability to purchase a firearm if you choose to. Whereas in our country, it's in the Constitution, right? This is an unalienable right, the same way that you have a right to speak, freedom of speech, or any of our other sort of rights. So I think it charges the debate a lot more, right? So when we talk about what are reasonable restrictions to this right, what we hear from the other side is, a lot of fear about not just taking my guns away, but also, tamping down my right. Now, I obviously have clear opinions about this issue. And I like to think that they're informed decisions. Conversely, I know that if someone were to try to step on the freedom of speech, that I would be, fervored in my response, right? So I try to think about that when working with people on the other side of this issue.
Right, and so it's seen more as a right as opposed to a privilege sometimes.
Yeah.
Right, okay. Gemma?
Yeah, I see that too, and I think that's what's holding up the conversation, because I think the majority of people that are gun owners, that they actually agree that there needs to be some type of limits placed, and I think it's reasonable just because of what we've been experiencing the last 20 years, or the last 10 years even, just of what's happening in this country. And I think that we have to move past that conversation and actually start talking to each other and not be so divisive. And really look at what's happening to our youth, what's happening to our cities, everything that's happening, the violence in this nation, and just being afraid to go to school should not be in a such advanced country as this. And I think that's the problem.
Yeah, absolutely. Eric?
yeah, kind of going along with that as well, I think there's a lot of misinformation on both sides. I think there's fear on both sides. And one of the biggest problems I think that the people who are afraid of gun control are having is that these decisions of gun control are being made out of fear or being wrongly attributed to certain things. Whether right or wrong, that's kind of your own opinion, but I think there's a fear that by only focusing on gun control, we might actually be missing the actual issue, or we're not looking in the right place. So I think that might be one of the big concerns there.
Definitely. And so our first audience question will focus on how to have tough conversations about our country's gun laws. But before we go into our audience, we want to emphasize the importance of balance in these conversations. In putting together this town hall, we reached out to a number of potential panelists, including our local NRA representative and a local gun shop owners, whom some declined to be here and some just couldn't be here. We look forward to hearing from our panelists and moving the conversation about guns in America forward. So our first question comes from Professor Melinda Crocus.
Thank you. My question is, in a recent Atlantic article, a gun owner mentions 3 groups of people. Those who see guns as dangerous, those who see guns as protection, and those who see guns as fun, actually. So in your experience, how do we get these 3 groups to have a dialogue that is just, compassionate, and transformative for America?
You could start. We don't have to always go in order each time, guys, so I just want to anybody wants to attack it first?
I think, so one thing I think is important to note when we're talking about gun violence prevention policies is to always sort of think about the end person, which of course oftentimes is victims, right? And when I have conversations with people, whether they be sort of people who find firearms as a way for sport or for protection, I try to really think about this issue in terms of the victims and how we can curb this. So that is to say, when you hear the NRA talk about gun deaths, their number's a lot lower than when I talk about gun deaths, and that reason's because they don't include things like suicides into gun deaths. They don't think that that's gun violence. I think that it is, right? So when we're having these conversations, I think it's important to always keep an eye towards the victims and what these policies are aiming to do. And to try to, draw that line, as Eric said, there's a lot of misinformation and there's a lot of concern, are we focusing on the right things? So if I'm talking to someone about, for instance, long guns and background checks, what I'll often hear is, background check, or let me rephrase, long guns aren't really used in crime. And that's true, most crimes committed with handguns. Conversely, what we're seeing is that long guns are being disproportionately used to kill law enforcement officers killed in the line of duty. They're also being disproportionately used against intimate partners in domestic violence situations, right? So again, having that conversation with someone and sort of redirecting that focus towards the victims, because ultimately, I think we all want to save lives any way that we can, and that it's not trying to take away someone's ability to have fun or ability to protect themselves. But again, who are these victims? How are they dying? And what policies can we put in place to try to help them? And I find that it's helpful to try to always keep in mind that victim component of it. How do we curb these trends?
Absolutely. Eric?
Yeah, and I think what also has to kind of happen with these conversations is we have to look at all facets of it. We can't just, we can do everything we can for prevention. Buildings are built to specific code to prevent fires. And yet I'm a volunteer firefighter EMT, and we have fires all the time in buildings, and while that is nowhere near, should be correlated to this kind of topic, it kind of puts into perspective of not only should we focus on some sort of logical gun reform, but also reaction methods of how do we properly respond if there's a gun death, or how do we make sure that our EMS and police are trained in taking care of these injuries where, just because you can get them on scene doesn't mean that it can prevent loss of life. An example was in Tunkhannock almost a year ago. There was 4 people shot in a Wise supermarket, and even though police were on scene very quickly, no one knew how to handle gunshot injuries because it doesn't really happen. And unfortunately, these people lost their lives. Now, could it have been prevented? Could it have been changed if they had the proper training? Maybe. But I think that's also something we have to look at is training procedures and how we go about reacting to these kind of events, because I think ultimately they're going to happen, maybe, and hopefully we can prevent it in the future from happening as often, but we still need to be prepared on how to go after it when it happens.
Gemma?
I think that a conversation has to start out of respect for both sides, and I think that in my family alone, I have people that have guns for protection, people that hunt, people that do target practice. So I have all that, and I know they're good people. They're not out to hurt anybody, and they would feel horrible when they hear these horrible stories on the news. But I also think, as Eric said, that it has to come back to the victim. When you're seeing an inordinate amount of people dying, gun deaths that are maybe preventable because of common sense gun laws that really aren't in place, just like when the seatbelt, issue happened, when they saw all these accidents and they changed that, we didn't take cars away, just change that to make things safer and to put some regulations on it. I think that we have to look at it as not an infringement of rights. You definitely can hunt, you could have fun, But to have some type of a weapon or a large capacity magazine that can kill, that's really a military grade type of weapon that can cause such massive damage, with the AR-15, a type of wound that it makes is not like a linear gunshot wound. I'm a nurse anesthetist. I worked in trauma for 11 years at Geisinger. I saw a lot of stuff go down. Those people have a chance. When you have someone shot from an AR-15, the way the velocity and the speed of that, it actually causes a cavication of the tissues around it. So it causes mass damage to kill somebody. So I think that has to be looked at. I think we have to have a logical, kind of rational, respectful conversation, but it needs to be discussed.
So a lot of these points we will return to, I promise you guys. But some great points right out of the gates. We'll be right back right after the break. Welcome back to our discussion of guns in America. For the next question, we're going to Nathan Holden in the audience.
Hi, I'm Nathan. My question is, do you think that effectively and strongly amending the Second Amendment is even possible?
We can start with you, go with the trend.
Sure. So I think changes to the Second Amendment specifically isn't possible. I think what's possible is what's around it. And there's a couple ways I think it's possible, right? So number one, when the Supreme Court issued the Heller decision, which says that the Second Amendment guarantees an individual right to have a firearm, that it doesn't have to be a well-regulated militia, Antonin Scalia, the late justice, obviously very conservative, in his opinion even writes, but like all of our rights, it's subjected to reasonable restrictions, right? So I think immediately the Supreme Court leaves the door open for a discussion about what are these reasonable restrictions. So I think it's certainly prudent that we have these conversations. And I think that, part of the entrepreneurial spirit of America is to find solutions to things. This is what we do as a country. And we just have to have the temerity and the courage to find solutions to these things. I always go back to something Senator Casey said, which was, after 9/11, no one threw their hands up in the air and said, well, terrorists will be terrorists. There's just nothing you can do about it. We created a new branch of the government. We changed airport culture completely, and we found solutions. And while we can't completely absolve ourselves from terrorist attacks, per se, we can make sure that it will never happen the way that happened again, right? So changing the Second Amendment specifically, probably not. However, there is the avenue to have a conversation about the restrictions around it. And I think it's really up to legislatures across the board in the states and to our federal government to have the courage to take up some of these issues.
Yeah, and I think this is kind of one of those areas that I was kind of saying earlier about a possible change in how you view it. The way I kind of see it is that in its essence, the Second Amendment isn't really the issue here. It's the issue of how we've evolved as a culture and a nation. And whenever you restrict something, regardless of what it is, you're starting to get into that really weird, hazy zone of, no, you can't do that. And to be real honest, it's kind of like a kid. You tell a kid you can't do something, they're gonna try and do it anyway. Don't touch the stove, it's hot. They're gonna burn themselves. So instead of focusing, I think, our efforts on completely trying to change the Second Amendment or restrict something, I honestly think we need to change how we're handling the policies already in place, maybe changing certain definitions or changing how we approach accessing weapons. It's great, you should be able to go to a range and shoot if you want to, or to go hunting, or to do all these things, or to have something for self-defense, but the way we do it has to change because we're seeing now it's just not effective. So.
And I think also too is, the actual Second Amendment got co-opted by the NRA. I think that, from the late 1800s till the 30s or maybe it was 50s, there was 4 decisions that came in front of the Supreme Court. And they were never upheld for individual gun rights. I'm not sure if you can go with that, but in the Heller decision, Scalia did uphold, individuals' right to bear arms, where it really wasn't even mentioned in the Constitutional Convention, even by Madison. So I think that, we have to look at why is there being such an outcry now from the NRA, which has now become something that was very useful in this country for gun safety, for marksmanship. That's how it started after, you know, the Union soldiers basically started that after the Civil War. And the thing is now it's co-opted into a backlash in the mid-70s where they actually threw out the people that actually wanted gun safety and things like that, and kind of became ideologues and, you know, and poured money into that as more of an ideology than actually what is just what it was. It was an amendment for the citizens of the United States. And I think that with that conversation, with getting that money and that lobby money and that ideological, you know, I'm going to dig my feet in the sand and not budge, you're never going to be able to have a rational conversation about amending the Second Amendment. I think that, you know, even with the March for Our Lives, those kids in Parkland, that whole Everytown movement, it's not to repeal the Second Amendment. It's just to actually make some laws that actually were on the books. We had an assault ban weapon till 1994, just was never re-upped. So I think that, you know, we have to look at why did that happen? Follow the money.
Right, and I was actually just going to ask you on top of that, because I want to get to another question after, but so is the NRA the catalyst, really? I mean, as you were talking about, people kind of clam up when we start discussing guns. Is the NRA the catalyst that is causing this fear amongst people?
I think the word I would use is the cancer, right? No, I mean, look, you know, sort of hyper-partisanship notwithstanding, I think what's important to note is not only did they abandon their aims to sort of be a sportsman organization for a much more political agenda, but also too, you know, the biggest myth that they perpetuate is that all of their money comes from just, you know, little old men who send in $5 a check, right? And that's not the case. We know that they are an industry consulting group that represents the interest of the people who make firearms, right? Mm-hmm. They hide their numbers because they don't actually want people to see how much, you know, Smith & Wesson and Behringer and all these gun manufacturers actually give them, right? So I think, you know, they unfortunately do so much more damage to the debate. And look, we see this play out in polls. When we talk about 97% of Americans are in favor of things like background checks, do you mean to tell me that some of that 97% of Americans aren't NRA members? Of course they are. We know that, you know, large numbers of NRA members are in favor of these sorts of policies, right? So, I mean, we see that play out in the polls, and I think, you know, really, one thing that I think that's encouraging after Parkland is that I think many individuals and corporations and people are really treating the NRA and exposing them with the toxicity that they have, right? Yeah. So I think that they do a lot more harm than good for this debate.
Yeah, and as we were kind of talking about the Second Amendment earlier, I want to read the Second Amendment and then kind of just ask what your interpretation is, each of you, what that is. So, a well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. So I'll start with you, Jeffrey. You can kind of go down the line and give your interpretation of what that means.
Yeah, I mean, I'm going to cop out a little bit, right? Because, you know, I do think that the Second Amendment certainly, it's worth noting that it was around long before the AR-15 was. And I think that it's changed, right? We know that our Constitution's a breathing document. Conversely, you know, I'm going to go back to the court because I do respect the Supreme Court's decisions, even if I disagree with them, that we recognize that it has an individual right to carry. But again, no right is absolute. You know, we know that there's things that you can't say. I can't start a church and have human sacrifice and say it's in the name of religion, right? So no rights completely, you know, blank check, and I don't think the Second Amendment's any exception.
Absolutely. Gemma?
Yeah, and I think also with the militia part, you know, when that was written is, you know, they were being oppressed by what they were feared, and they wanted some weapons. Right now, even if you say, oh, it's a militia, the thing is, or, you know, as someone to create a militia in case the government went haywire, our government has, I mean, you know what I don't even know half the stuff they have. I mean, the bombs and the capability of squashing somebody with 20 AR-15s. So, I mean, I think that definitely, you know, there is a right to bear arms. I think that's part of our Constitution. And although I'm not a gun owner, I do respect that. But I think that there needs to be respect the other way. And to say, if you realize that people are actually are dying at an alarming rate, that we need to have a conversation, look at it. And actually, and just a caveat, you know, the NRA, I think, just really plays on that divisiveness. And I think that really, they know what they're doing because they know it stalls conversations. And I think that's a major problem with the NRA.
Eric?
Yeah, to be honest, I think I'm going to deviate a little bit from the trend and say that I truly think that the Second Amendment is still viable today because so, you know, look at the term militia there. You know, essentially a militia is a non-organized government. I've seen people argue that, well, we have the National Guard to keep states free. Well, that's still, like, my name tape still says U.S. Army. You know, it's still a government-controlled, government-paid organization. And in its essence, I believe the reason why the Second Amendment was put in there was to preserve that right of self-defense and to preserve the right of autonomy of yourself and not have to rely on other instances, because the reason why the British lost the Revolutionary War is because they were fighting a bunch of farmers with guns, that they didn't play by the rules. The United States Army, we are one of the most best equipped, best trained fighting personnel, and we, for the longest time, were losing wars against unconventional people. Let's look at Vietnam. You know, let's look at earlier in Afghanistan and Iraq. We learned that guns and bombs and, you know, tactics don't destroy the enemy. It's fighting an ideologically instead. So to me, that Second Amendment is saying that you as a citizen, you are capable and have that free autonomy to defend yourself, because you should not have to rely on any other organization to do that for you. And by looking at the term "to bear arms," while you can find, you know, funny pictures of like, hey, look, I have bare arms, you know, to bear arms, that's not talking about a rifle. That's not mentioning, if it said specifically a musket or a rifle, then it's a different conversation. But, you know, that's a knife, that's a hatchet, that's a hammer, or any tool you can use to defend yourself. So I think that's where the core of its meaning is. And while we can say that, you know, they didn't have AR-15s back in that time, you're right. But at the same time, they didn't have a lot of things that the Constitution was written about. They didn't have a lot of the same problems of the press. So freedom of press, does that govern, you know, technology? They didn't have electricity, let alone, you know, the internet or anything. So is the internet journalism freedom of press, or is it just written? So I feel like we have to be really careful about some of these arguments made, because when applied to generalized universal concepts, they don't really hold up. So, you know, that's kind of where I'm at with the Second Amendment. And that's kind of why I think that focusing on it too much is not the answer. It's actually focusing on the things that are coming about and the negative things that are coming about from it. So.
Right. And I just want to ask this question very quickly, but so like it's such a controversial thing that even the former Associate Justice of the U.S. Supreme Court was calling to repeal it. Is calling to repeal the Second Amendment, is that shutting down the conversation? Is it a realistic idea? What do you guys think about this, just very quickly?
I certainly have a lot of respect for former Justice Stevens and probably agree with him more than I disagree. I would say, just from a practical point of view, calling for an all-out repeal, I think, really does close more doors than it opens, and it makes it very challenging to talk with people on this. And I think that it's ultimately maybe a little bit maybe of a step back.
Right, absolutely.
I think that same way. As I said, I'm not a gun owner and I'm not a big proponent of guns, but I think that we have a constitution, and you know, and I think that if it comes to that eventually, if we as a society decide that, then that's fine. But I think that kind of rhetoric is just as bad as the NRA rhetoric, and then it stops conversations. So I think that we have to kind of work on a middle ground and get to a common goal.
Definitely, Eric.
Yeah, I would have to agree with that, because you know, it's kind of like attributing, you have extreme conservatives and extreme Democrats, and at their core, they're both radicals. They're both the same. And by going one extreme or another, all you're doing is closing doors, and you're not actually working towards a solution, because at the end of the day, there's no such thing as a duality that exists in this world. There's no right and wrong, or even perceptions and moral codes. This is why we have a whole study of ethics and morals. You know, if it was that easy to have a duality, then we wouldn't have that. So I think that by saying stuff like that, the only thing they're doing is, I firmly believe they're pushing their own agenda. Right. For whatever that is, we don't know, but you know.
So avoiding extremes, having conversations. Yes.
Yeah.
Some great points, guys. We're going to be right back after the break. Thank you for tuning back into TV-Marywood. We're going to switch gears a little bit and talk about gun-free zones. Our next question comes from Brenna Williams.
My just question is if they work. Gun-free zones, do they work, in your opinion?
You can go.
Sure. In my experience, what happens is you hear a lot of, when you're having this conversation with people, you'll hear folks on the other side say things like gun-free zones are targeted because they're gun-free zones. I think that that's a little bit of, well, no, I don't think it's a little bit. I think that that's sort of a false narrative. What happens is oftentimes what we see are mass shootings occur because the shooter is targeting someone specifically or is familiar with the location, and that's why they're chosen. I think the thing about gun-free zones, what's worth noting is a little bit separate, which is that I can understand that having a firearm on a person makes them feel safer, right? But we need to really sort of flesh this out with some science. You know, a recent study shows that the New York City Police Department, one of the most well-trained police departments, one of the largest police departments in our country, when under fire, officers shoot at about an 18% accuracy. And I think, you know, when we talk about gun-free zones, it kind of goes to this myth that just because someone has a concealed carry license or has a gun, if things, you know, sort of become, you know, explosive or something, an incident happens, that they're magically going to turn into John Wick and start, you know, pulling off headshots, right? And we know that that's not true. If you look at some mass shootings, specifically the Gabby Giffords, when Congresswoman Gabby Giffords was shot at Marywood-University, when that shooting happened, there are individuals in the audience who have license to carry, concealed carry, and have presumably some, you know, some familiarity with firearms. And we hear a lot of the same things come up again and again, which was, I couldn't get to my gun fast enough, or I was worried for being confused as the shooter, or I didn't know where the shots were coming from. And I have found that when we're talking about gun-free zones, what often kind of becomes this sort of debate, which is, you know, we should be able to have guns. The only way to stop a bad guy with a gun is a good guy with a gun. And it kind of gets all lost. So do gun-free zones work? I mean, I think, you know, they certainly can. But I also think that sometimes when we have this debate, it tends to get hijacked and kind of go in kind of crazy directions.
Gemma?
Yeah, I agree with that too. I think that that gives you a false sense of safety too, because you don't know, just like you said, somebody comes in with a gun and is there to kill somebody, and just you get caught in the crossfires. It doesn't matter if it's a gun-free zone or not. And I think a lot of times too that, you know, I know they're in the Capitol building as gun-free zones, but I mean, just a few years ago, there was in a rural community in Pennsylvania at a city council meeting, you know, 3 people or 4 people, I think, were killed by somebody coming in, and there was probably likelihood of somebody having a gun there that could have, you know, thought maybe they could save somebody or whatever. But I just think that we have a gun-free zone at my hospital. I work up in Tunkhannock, which is very rural, and a lot of people probably carry guns or have them in their cars. But that does not make me feel safe. Anybody can get in there. Anything can happen. So I just think that that's a false sense of security.
Yeah, I'd have to agree. I think what many people don't realize is every military base is actually a gun-free zone. You can't have personal firearms. You can't have any other firearms. You can't own them. You can't carry them on base. If you have them, you need to register them when you get to the gate, and then you either leave them there, or then it gets personally escorted by the military police officer to the unit. Now, so I was an armor, so I was in charge of all of our unit's firearms. I had a vault that was akin to a bank vault. You know, I had to have a security code. If I didn't turn off certain systems in a certain amount of time, then multiple SWAT teams were en route. And in my barracks rooms, we lived on base, you couldn't have weapons. 4 rooms down from me, a soldier discharged a firearm twice, a pistol that was unregistered, and he was not allowed, obviously since it was unregistered, he didn't purchase it. It's not military issue, and he was still able to get it on base and discharge it. Thankfully, he was just drunk and an idiot. But it's the fact, and then we also have, like, Fort Hood has had multiple shootings on base. And so all it does is create this sense of security. We all thought, like, oh, well, if somebody has a gun, then military police, or we'll just run over and grab ours, and it doesn't work like that, you know. So I kind of don't see them as effective, and I don't see them as working just because of my experience and what I can see from anything else. I think that's a great point. Kind of lulls you into that false sense of security that, hey, you know, it's safe. But in reality, you know, if somebody wants to do harm, and I hate to use that excuse sometimes, but you know, it's just like if somebody wants to kill themselves, they're going to find a way.
Right,
you know.
Just real quick, I mean, I would like to say, though, that, I mean, I think despite issues about the debate or what happens when we start talking about them, I think that we can agree, or at least it's certainly my opinion and the opinion of our organization, that there are places that we don't need firearms involved. I mean, we reject this premise that our schools are going to be safer if we start arming teachers and arming cafeteria workers. And moreover, when you talk to teachers and cafeteria workers, they don't want to be armed, right? So, regardless of gun-free zones, whether they're sort of a more apt target for shooters or a false sense of safety notwithstanding, I do think that there are certain areas that absolutely should be gun-free zones.
Right. Okay. All great points, guys. Stay tuned. We'll be right back. And thank you for sticking with us. So, Jeff, I want to talk to you a little bit about Ceasefire PA. It's an organization that's been around through many of these mass shootings. So recently, after the Parkland shooting, have you noticed any difference in people wanting to become a part of it? Any pushback, any donations?
Yeah, so certainly membership's gone up, right? And I think that, we're certainly fielding a lot of calls. People want to know more about this issue, how to talk about this issue. And we're seeing a response from legislators as well. We're seeing more legislators sort of try to introduce legislation, try to talk about bills. Just this week, the Pennsylvania House Judiciary Committee is hosting hearings on it. Now, we're certainly grateful for that. We'd like to see the next step, which is a vote on some of these policies. But nevertheless, this is a committee that traditionally has a very closed-door policy when even talking about these things. So the fact that they're doing it, I think, is a change. And I think nationally you're seeing a change that's different in a response than ever before. You're seeing corporations respond differently to this mass shooting. Just today, Bank of America changes some of the ways that they're going to provide funding to gun manufacturers specifically. So, I mean, I think you're seeing a corporate response that's very different. Obviously, students, all over Pennsylvania. I think there were over 22 different March for Our Lives events that just occurred within the Commonwealth, and you're seeing students sort of take on this issue more and more. So there is something a bit different in the response this time around.
Absolutely. So we're going to go to Anna Naeem for the next question.
Do you believe mass shootings would decrease if the media didn't shed light on and romanticize the shooter and instead focused on the victims?
So we'll start with Eric on this one, just to kind of.
Yeah, I mean, I've kind of had this, I guess you could call it a running theory for a while, experiencing that. I think that our media plays a huge part in this idea of mass shootings or any sort of mass tragedy, and it also doesn't help where they start publicizing, hey, this is how the shooter did it, this is what they used, this is how they accessed it. I mean, for somebody that really wants to do some harm, that's giving them information. Information is the key to any sort of, what if you want to call it a victory on the mass shooter's part. So I think the media has a bigger responsibility than I think they realize. And sometimes I also wonder their motivations and, like being, okay, we have a 24-hour news station. We need to start making coverage and talk about this. And I think that they should also be held responsible in some form or way by us as well of, hey, you know what? We don't want to hear this kind of rhetoric. We want to know what is being done for the victims. What can we do? What can we do to help make sure this doesn't happen again? Stuff like that. I don't personally think we need to know the name and the age and the background of the shooter, because at the end of the day, that should be left to the authorities. That's not necessary information for us. That's not going to change my opinion of, wow, I can't believe that just happened, and what can we do to prevent this? So I think there is a little bit of romanticizing there, and the media needs to be more held responsible for it.
Gemma?
I think that, we live in a different age now with mass media, social media, internet, everybody's connected at all times. I think it's hard to go back. I do agree, I think the 24-hour news coverage is done. It's done a lot more harm than good, maybe in a lot of situations. But I think that it needs to be exposed. I also question even people being they don't realize that it's a person that was a victim, and maybe seeing actual. I mean, I hate saying that, but maybe because we have been in medicine, so we see the end result of somebody that's shot in the chest. So. I think you can distance yourself from that fact of someone laying there with a gaping wound in their chest, especially a 5 or 6-year-old from Newtown. But the thing is also is there always going to be copycat murders. I don't think it romanticizes it enough. I think that it's not going to tip the scales on someone that's mentally ill. I don't think. I think that if you have that in your heart, If you're going to do something like that, you're going to do that no matter what. So I think that there is some, credence to what Eric says about the 24-hour news cycle, but I don't think that that's the issue. I do think that the culture, though, has changed as far as these games and these, not an excuse for any type of reform that needs to be done. But I think that we need to relook at a lot of the stuff that's going on, what kids are engaging in.
Jeff?
I think at the heart of your question is this idea that are we focusing more on the shooters themselves and maybe their backgrounds, and we're losing sight of some of the victims and some of the important questions to be asked. And if we think about that and we approach it from that angle, I think that answer is certainly yes, right? Mass shootings are tragic and horrific and really unfathomable. Conversely, we know that there's gun violence that occurs in cities every day, right? We know that there are shootings that occur in municipalities every day. We know that there are suicides that occur every day. We know that there's intimate partner violence that occurs every day, right? So I think in a lot of the coverage of mass shootings, we tend to lose sight of just how prolific the issue of gun violence really is, and that it's not just students at a specific school or concert goers, but really, people in all of our different communities are impacted by this issue. And I think sometimes there is a real focus on the shooter or on the narrative surrounding it, and we're losing track of it. Moreover, there's also a lot of questions we're not asking. A lot of times it's, what the shooter's motivation was, but not did they, I think of Aurora. There's all this focus on the shooter because of his abnormal hair color and whatnot, but nobody was really focusing on the fact that this gentleman systematically built up an arsenal legally for months, and at no point was any red flag ever offered up, even as they're buying things like, smoke bombs and bulletproof vests and thousands of rounds of ammunition and multiple firearms, that there's no system in place to ask that question. So I think it distracts from maybe some of the more pertinent questions we should be asking and takes away from the victims.
And well, we've seen a lot of gun violence in the news, especially lately. In fact, in 2014, the FBI released statistics saying nearly 12,000 people were killed by murder in the U.S., and over 8,000 of those cases were by a firearm. And although we don't lead in gun murders in the world, that's places like Honduras, we do lead in industrialized democracies. So we're more than 12 times the rate in Italy, 7 times the rate of Canada, and about 30 times the rates of Great Britain and France. So I know this may seem like kind of an obvious question, but will banning guns or stricter gun reform, will that actually affect the numbers of gun cases and crime? Yeah, you can.
Yeah, so I mean, I think we have to do something, right? And when I look at the legislative history, what I see is a whole lot of nothing. The background check system is far from perfect. It's over-inclusive in some ways, and it's under-inclusive in some ways. But at the same time, we don't even require the background check for all sales of guns, right? When I look at the legislative record just in Pennsylvania, what do I see? I see legislation that punishes cities that try to pass their own gun laws. I see attempts to try to remove the PIC system, which is the Pennsylvania Instant Background Check System. I see attempts to arm teachers, and at no point in time are we actually asking ourselves, are there policies that we can put in place to help these things, to try to bring down some of these numbers? So I think, for me, will we ever solve all gun crimes? No, right? We can't solve all crimes committed with guns. Conversely, we have to do something, right? We have to try to address these issues. The comparison is often made to vehicles, right? I mean, we didn't just make the car and say, okay, we're done, right? We constantly added things and safety mechanisms to it to try to make it better. Right. And we just don't do that when it comes to guns. We say, bad guys will be bad guys, or if they want to kill someone, they'll kill someone, or we can't impact law-abiding gun owners, and we just sort of throw our hands up and we don't do anything to try to tackle this issue head on.
Yeah.
Sorry, go ahead. No, you can go ahead.
Go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to kind of jump on that because I truly believe he's right in a lot of the idea of that we have a lot of flaws in our background check system, and I personally don't think that is even enough, but I don't want to make it more restrictive. I know people have talked about the idea of mental health. I have a friend who she is a mental health counselor. She has a master's degree and everything, and we had this conversation. She used to be on the interviewing committee for the state police. They interview their people coming in, and she said in the first 10 minutes, I can tell if somebody's unstable or not. And, you know, she's like, it's not just about, oh, they can come in and lie. It's like these counselors, they learn how to read body language, how to interpret questions, how to ask certain questions. And I kind of wonder, like, including with background checks and making it so that there aren't any as easy loopholes, you know, okay, you have 3 days to wait for your background check. You need to go get signed off by a counselor. And whether it's just, I want to buy a rifle to go shooting for fun, for sport. Okay, we're just making sure and checking the blocks that, you know, you're kind of okay to do it. You're not suffering from current depression. We don't have, for some reason, we don't have a problem going to the doctor once a year just to get a general checkup, yet we seem to have this negative stigma on, hey, why don't you go to a counselor or therapist once a year just for a quick checkup, make sure everything's good. And an additional thing is, one of the biggest things that hit the opioid issue in Pennsylvania was starting to make a universal system that doctors can pull up your name and everything and see, wow, you just filled a prescription in this pharmacy a couple days ago and you're asking for another prescription at these different hospitals. You know, why can't we have a universal system like that for buying guns? Right. Like, why can it, oh, wow, you just bought like 2 rifles last week. What's going on, you know?
I think the NRA would have something to say about that, right?
I think we give the NRA more power than it actually has, to be honest. I think it has a lot of funding and it sends a lot of money, but the closest numbers I've seen to membership is like 17 million in a country that has 315 million people in it. So that's like less than what, 2%?
But I think that the problem with the NRA, I mean, just an aside note, is that they're able to finance campaigns for people in Congress and basically write legislation and hand that to them, or threaten them that if they pass that, they're not going to get their campaigns funded. We see that with Rubio. So I think that although there is a lot of good, you know, there may not be a lot of people that may contribute to the NRA, the people that are in the NRA that are the money people, the people that are selling these guns and things like that, they're the people that are lobbying, because at the end of the day, it's profits. So I think that's where we need to separate the NRA as a lobby and the NRA as gun owners that are just contributing $5 a month and just a law-abiding gun owner. But on the point, a couple points, just with the loopholes, I think, and correct me if I'm wrong, but in Pennsylvania, the long guns, which is, there is assault weapons or a long gun, or semi-automatic assault weapons or whatever they are, the AR-15, they are not required to have a background check if sold by a private person or like at a gun show or things like that. So these are the things that could actually kill the most amount of people. Like, so I don't understand where that logic is. So I mean, just basics, common sense gun laws. I definitely do think of mental health things. We just saw deregulation of, the last administration's laws about people being able to buy weapons that had mental illness history. This administration took away that. So that is definitely a question. And as far as what your point was about different countries, I mean, I know people always point to Australia, but they didn't get rid of all of their guns. They just got rid of things like automatic guns. I mean, people still have guns, and they did see a decrease in gun deaths. So it does happen. I mean, we just have to stop with all this pointing fingers, and just at the end of the day, it's about people are really dying here.
Great points, everybody. Continual great points. We'll be right back after the break. Welcome back. I'm your host, Christy O'Neill. We're going to our next question to Autumn Boner.
What would be the effects of banning guns entirely in America?
Could start with maybe Gemma on this one, just to try and mix some things up.
I don't think it's possible. I mean, I think that, I don't know how it would be. I would be, in a perfect world for me, because I'm not a gun owner, but I don't know. I mean, I know there's always going to be ways to kill people, injure people. There's always going to be the underground system of getting guns, and it's actually legal now, with, like we said, without the background checks for different private sales and stuff. And there's not a national registry even for private sales to see if, criminals are selling these guns. So that's another problem. But I think that if we strive for that perfect, scenario as no guns and no deaths, we're not really in reality. I think we have to look at the whole picture realistically and say, You know, what are the things that we can actually do real time that could save some lives? And then, you know, maybe ever get to that point, I don't know. But I don't think that that needs to be our goal, because I think that you lose a lot of people that are gun owners on that point. And I don't think it's a fair question to ask them at this point. So although I agree, because I'm not a gun owner, but I do respect other people's, you know, willingness to have protect themselves with a gun.
Eric?
I think to answer your question, the effects, I honestly, that's not something that I don't think anyone can accurately answer, because it's kind of like predicting the future. But the way I kind of see it, and when seeing statistics on, and my own experience with running with fire and EMS, is that I don't know if we get as big of a difference as we kind of hope. I don't know if it would impact that much, actually, of the deaths and the crime rate and stuff like that. I think that the only thing that would happen is just then you're kind of just removing guns from everywhere else. And but on that note, I think that you know, I bring it up again, where I think that kind of looking at it from that point of view isn't necessarily the right answer, because I kind of see a society where I would love it if people were not afraid of guns, where people could own guns, and that people were actually educated on them. Like very simple rules we use in the military of you don't shoot at it, or you don't point at anything you don't intend to shoot. You keep your finger off the trigger, and you never accept a weapon from somebody else without checking to see if it's loaded, and you never keep it loaded. You know, they're simple rules that I know so many people that I responded to a guy that was checking out his neighbor's pistol and accidentally shot himself in the arm. And it was because he was breaking all of those rules. He didn't check to see if it was loaded. He had his finger on the trigger, and he was pointing it at himself. You know, and you know, I just wonder if we could approach it from that sense. I feel like that would be a more reasonable approach, and pushing the idea of education and making it so we don't have people afraid of guns. We don't have people saying, well, that gun looks scary, let's ban it. No, respect it, but don't be afraid of it, because if you're afraid of it, then you will always, that's always when accidents happen, you know, so.
So education.
Yeah.
That's important, yeah. Jeff?
I think for starters, I'd probably be unemployed. No, but you know, all kidding aside, I think, you know, look, I certainly agree with the ideas of the panelists. I would say this though, I mean, I think we have to get something very clear, which is we would have, you know, we lose 30,000 people a year, right? We lose roughly 98 people a day. You know, we're losing lives because of guns. And while I don't think we can ever obtain, and maybe nor should we ever obtain, you know, a United States without guns, we have to do something, because we are losing our mothers and fathers and children and kids to these things, these instruments. And we have to do something. We have to act up, and we have to try to change this tide. So I don't necessarily know what the world would look like without them. And I don't even know if that's obtainable, or if that's something we should strive towards. But conversely, you know, anybody who says now's not the time to talk about it, or it's not the gun, it's the people, is really sort of selling you a pail of goods, right? Because it is the gun, right? Something, you know, we're not losing 98 people a day to knives, right? We're not losing 30,000 people a year to, you know, to fistfights. So, you know, we do have to have conversations about this.
Yeah, and for the last few minutes, I kind of want to talk about the March for Our Lives. So I know we had one here in Scranton, as you said earlier, and we had some all over the entire country. So I want to get some of your reactions on that. And also, do you think young people are making the difference in this gun reform debate? And so I can start. Does anyone want to start?
I'll start.
Yeah,
I'm just going to whip out my little T-shirt here. And we have a March for Our Lives Facebook page, a community page, and we update things regularly. We have a student group starting, and these are from Scranton. A lot of people were asking that they are available on our Facebook page, and they're going to fund future events for children to meet their legislators and just to get them involved in the conversation. I was shocked at how many kids were interested from all walks of life. From kids that come from minimal means to affluent kids, all colors, that have legitimate issues, not maybe a fear of these mass shootings, although they deal with a lot of these drills every day that they're afraid of, but in their own communities, in the people of color's communities, that many people have lost their family members to gun violence or to you know, some kind of a police brutality thing. So I think that conversation has to be talked about too, and I think with Parkland, those kids brought up all voices. And I'm seeing that movement now. And I think in order to change things, you have to have intensity. And I think that the preference for many years with most people were there needs to be some types of gun reform. After Parkland, I think the intensity just went through the roof because of the students. And I'm seeing that moving forward in our community as well.
And unfortunately, we're running out of time, but you're totally fine. I want to give everyone at least like 30 seconds, just kind of final thoughts, wrap it up. Start with you, Eric.
So essentially, I'm all for, common sense gun control, but I feel like it has to be brought on the right approach from the right way. No political ties, no pushing agendas. Just hey, we're looking out for our other people, but also be educated about it. Know the difference between an AR-15 and an M4. That one is select fire, the other one's semi-automatic. Know what these definitions are. Because once we start perpetuating false information, that's when people start getting up in arms and keep having these misconceptions that we're trying to prevent today. So,
I just think that the conversation needs to keep happening. I think it's great that people are actually talking to one another now. I think that now that with there's going to be a study that's going to start again now that the CDC was halted on, and I think that's going to look, because it's a public safety, it's a public epidemic.
Well, and the students, they gave us the task, right? Now we have to do the next step, which is, the time has come. If legislators are inactive on this, if they're not stepping up, if they're not passing these policies, talking about them, voting on them, then we have to respond in the booth, in the ballot box. Right. We can't let these kids down. We've already stripped away their sense of safety. And we can't strip away their hope, right? But they can't do all that they're doing, and our response is to do nothing again. Right, so we all have to take that next step to actually make sure that action comes from this and that things actually change.
Absolutely, and I want to thank all of you so much for being here. I want to thank our studio audience here, and I want to thank you for tuning in to TV Marywood. Make sure you follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram, and have a great night.